Welcome, everyone. It is noon, and we want to get started promptly here at noon. So I will get us underway. August, next slide, please. So as we get started here, just if you're hearing me, please test out the Zoom reaction functions. Give me a thumbs up. And we encourage you throughout today's webinar to use the reactions feature, keep things light and breezy, and let us know you're hearing us. And we also encourage you to use the chat and Q&A features as well to post questions and engage with one another throughout the webinar. I am Jeremy Hansen. I am the coordinator for the Chesapeake Bay Program's Water Quality Goal Implementation Team with the Chesapeake Research Consortium, and I am playing host today for our second Submersion Series webinar. Our topic is Making Science Work for You: How to Strengthen the Connection Between Water Quality Studies and Agricultural Conservation Efforts. Next slide. So those of you on the call very likely already know what the Water Quality Goal Implementation Team is, or Water Quality GIT, and what it does within the Bay Program Partnership. But to summarize, for anyone who might be less familiar, we work to evaluate, focus, accelerate implementation of practices, policies, programs that will restore water quality in the Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries to conditions that support living resources and protect human health. And that's the official version. During our last adaptive management review, the goal team leadership and our members acknowledged we often struggle with finding balance in our packed agendas, our monthly meetings. So we often find our agendas dominated by modeling or time-sensitive decisional items. And rather than add more standard business meetings to the crowded calendar, we wanted to find ways to bring more focus to priority issues that we otherwise struggle to find time for, and to engage in collaborative discussions. That idea became what we're calling the Submersion Series. So this is a quarterly discussion series. This is just our second session. And our intention here is to host exploratory and collaborative conversations that challenge us to confront emerging scientific or social lessons with management opportunities. And these are designed for contribution, not consumption. So we strive to include a diverse range of experts and professionals to have these honest conversations around these critical topics identified by the GIT and the broader partnership. So I challenge everyone to view these conversations while we're recording them as an opportunity to share and contribute your thoughts and ideas. I will say here at the beginning that thoughts or questions expressed in our shared space are our own and not necessarily reflect those views of our respective organizations, the Water Quality GIT, its leadership, or the Bay Program itself. So I challenge you to be constructive, be civil, but also you're welcome to show a little courage or even be a little provocative if desired. And the point here is to foster connection both within the Water Quality GIT and across our partnership so that we can improve our collective ability to innovate in face of our biggest challenges or opportunities. So as a reflection of that intent, the planning team has gathered speakers divided among two discussion topics that they'll describe for you shortly. We have great attendance that extends beyond our normal cohort, so I want to thank everyone for showing up, because whatever your affiliation might be, or regardless of where you live or work, you're online with us because you're invested in the Chesapeake Bay and environmental work, and you care. Next slide. And we all share a vision like the one from the 2014 Watershed Agreement, which I won't read for you. Go ahead, next slide, please. And I must acknowledge the incredible multi-partner team that worked behind the scenes to put this webinar together in this session specifically. So as the Water Quality GIT and the coordinator, we merely play host and contribute as part of the team that in this case spanned across multiple federal and state agencies, academic and non-governmental partners. So I'm not going to read all the names, and what I have listed on the slide probably still omits people, but I just want to thank everyone for their contributions, their ideas, the energy that made this happen. Next slide. And with that, I'll humbly pass it off to our two great moderators. We have James or Jimmy Weber, an hydrologist with the U.S. Geological Survey, and Dr. Kaylin Gutman, a life scientist with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the Chesapeake Bay Program Office. Next slide, August, but you can go ahead and go to the next one after that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy, and welcome everyone. It's really great to see so many participants at this workshop. When I saw the registration numbers and see all of you on the call, it really highlights the broad interest in this topic of agricultural conservation and water quality. You all represent many different groups and agencies. Some of you focus on collecting and analyzing water quality data, and some of you plan conservation strategies with local groups and landowners. Some of you do both. We're here today to continue conversations about strengthening the connections between water quality studies and conservation. You'll hear some lessons learned from water quality studies that can inform management decisions, and you'll hear about opportunities for future work to address stakeholder needs. Next slide, please. The first half of this workshop will focus on what we've learned from water quality studies that can inform agricultural conservation efforts. Across these 5 talks and speakers you see listed here, you'll hear about the importance of targeting practices on the landscape, what can be accomplished with detailed conservation plans, some challenges associated with increasing nutrient applications, considerations for managing sediment, and ingredients for effective water quality conservation. These short presentations provide insights that can inform the way we're managing the landscape to improve water quality. Move to the next slide, and I'll pass it over to our other moderator, Dr. Kaylin Gutman.
Thanks so much, Jimmy. Really, really appreciate it. So after Jimmy is going to lead that first portion, we'll have a short Mentimeter aided discussion section, and then we'll jump into part 2, where we're really asking, what do we need from future water quality studies when we're thinking about, this main idea, strengthening connections between water quality studies and agricultural conservation practices. We'll get a perspective from Maryland and RCS, a nice overview of some feedback from STAC. I'll be talking about Chesapeake Bay program monitoring networks and those needs. And we'll wrap up there with looking at, responses in small agricultural watersheds. So we'll have a discussion to follow as well. So if you go to the next slide, please. And, when planning this workshop, we had a diverse group in our group. We had a lot of different perspectives and ideas. And something that really came to mind for Jimmy and I was we really want to make sure we're all kind of talking the same language. We want to make sure we're on the same page here when we're using different terminology. So again, this workshop is going to focus on water quality effects of agricultural conservation efforts, and just have some definitions here. When we're talking about water quality effects for this webinar, we're talking about nutrient and sediment reductions in non-tidal rivers and streams. And again, conservation efforts, we're referencing practices and activities designed to reduce nutrient and sediment loads. And we're really going to be highlighting lessons learned from a variety of studies, talking about water quality studies. And a big point that came up in our planning meetings was talking about social science. So we're not leaving that out intentionally. This was for the sake of time, but this is something we'd like to continue the conversation about specifically in the future. Next slide, please. And, we're really trying to garner a diverse audience. I see 82 participants here on this webinar. We know that some folks are researchers, some are managers, some are neither, some are both. And we're really trying to design and continue conversations about how we evaluate the effects of agricultural conservation efforts. There is a really broad scope of information relevant to the workshop, including insights about the time of studies, where those studies take place, what kind of practices are put on the ground, and what else exists there. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn it over here in just a second to August, and we are going to be not only test driving our Mentimeter setup here, but this is a really important foundational question that we'd like to gather some data, some information about you, our audience. So we're going to be asking you in just a moment to answer this question. How do you define yourself within the Chesapeake Bay community? Management, research, both or neither? So August, I'll turn it over to you for this first Mentimeter practice run.
Thank you, Kaylin. So if you are not familiar with, you're going to either use your cell phone if you have nearby, or open up a browser on your computer going to go to www.menti.com and enter 65233449, or you can scan the QR code on the screen. All right. So to start, we're just going to ask you all a little bit about who you are, who's joining us today.
And folks, we're going to be using the same Mentimeter link and code throughout. So if you have it on your phone, just lock your screen, keep it there. August will be able to advance the slides, or if you have another browser tab, don't close it.
But if you do happen to close it, that's okay. We will have the code and the QR code up again. So no worries if you do.
Wow, we're getting a pretty even split here. Okay, we got 59 participants, 61 that answered this question, and about 86 in the room. So I'm waiting a couple more folks.
This is a well-balanced group.
No, this feels like a statistical anomaly. Yeah, give it a few more seconds here. I know we've got a very full agenda, but it seems like we've got a group that's pretty well Mentimetered.
And if you are neither and you want to share what you do consider yourself, you could enter that in the chat. That'd be good to know.
Okay, we're seeing pretty stable here at 68, which is fantastic. Final call. Oh, one more. Okay. Well, I think this is fantastic, and I think we're ready to jump into part one. So thank you all, and you'll be asked to participate at least 2 more times. So thanks.
Yeah, that's great. So we're going to start part one of the workshop now, focusing on that question of, what have we learned from water quality studies? And our first speaker is going to be Dr. Zach Easton. Dr. Easton is a professor in the Department of Biological Systems Engineering at Virginia Tech. He focuses his research on water resources. So thanks for joining us, Zach. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Jimmy. Appreciate it. I'm glad to be here, I guess, this afternoon, technically, and hope this is an enjoyable Submersion Series. I'm going to talk about the importance of targeting, and I'm actually going to change my title a little bit. I'm just going to talk about the importance of targeting, because it's not just landscape features that we need to target, and I'll talk about that briefly in a moment. Next slide, please. So there's lots of studies out there that suggest somewhere between 5 and 20% of the land area generates anywhere from 50 to 90% or more of the runoff and non-point source nutrient loads that we see across the landscape. And what we also see from a lot of these studies is that scale is relatively invariant. It doesn't matter whether you're at the scale of the Chesapeake Bay, like in that central image there of delivered phosphorus loads, you can see quite a bit of variability across the entire bay, or at the scale of a 25-acre farm, field, or parcel, and anywhere in between, 9,000-acre watershed or a 400-acre farm. And so within fields, these nutrient losses may be confined to relatively small areas that with correct targeting and incentives could be easily treated. There are other studies that have shown that targeting BMPs to these sites with higher pollution potentials can in fact improve conservation program effectiveness and reduce the costs associated with pollution reductions. Next slide, please. So I just put here some pictures, and actually this one is the one that I use as my background for Zoom, showing how much variability you might see across relatively small areas of the landscape. This is a single pasture where you see concentrated flow paths forming. Another pasture here with saturated areas. Next slide, please. And then some more images, some row crop fields, dairy farm, another dairy farm here. Again, these are areas of the landscape that we can, with the correct tools, relatively easily identify and ideally be able to treat with the correct conservation measure. Next slide, please. So when I talk about targeting, there's a few things that I'd like people to remember, take home, I guess, right? The first is that landscape areas or different actors on those landscapes produce disproportionate loads. And some of those pictures I showed previously exemplify that. Second is that there are incentives or program modifications that we could probably make that can motivate treatment of these high loading areas. And then the third is we need to be able to select the most cost-effective control measures to treat those loads. So I tried to create a catchy phrase that like would help me remember what I'm talking about, and I call it the 4 R's of targeting, similar to the 4 R's of nutrient management. So we want to be able to identify the right source of the problem. So are you able to identify and address the source? Is it a legacy nutrient problem? Is it a contemporary nutrient problem? Is it a surface water problem or a groundwater problem, etc.? You want to be able to identify the right location. So can you define the features of the landscape or system that are contributing to those loads, such as concentrated flow paths, or as in my background shows here, variable source critical source areas, or groundwater recharge zones, etc. Can you identify the right actors responsible for producing those loads? Do you have access to dealing with or to incorporating these actors into your conservation plans? And these are the people that influence nutrient loads on the landscape. And then finally, do you have the right treatment option? Can you identify which BMPs are most effective for which situation? Next slide, please. Then finally, these last 2 slides, I just wanted to show some sort of simple examples of how we might conceptualize targeting, one with respect to landscape and landforms, one with respect to different actors. So this is a study that the National Academy of Sciences did in the New York City watershed, looking at, in this case, soil test phosphorus levels and how they varied across the landscape as a function of different landforms. And in this case, they used a soil topographic wetness index, which corresponds to fields that have a greater tendency to become saturated and produce runoff. And what you see here is that indeed, we tend to have much higher soil test phosphorus levels in these wet areas, the blue areas, the landscape here. So this would indicate a great potential for incorporating targeting to address these issues. Last slide, please. And finally, this is a study done in the Shenandoah Valley that looked at phosphorus mass balances across 58 different farms, and saw a huge, dairy farms specifically, and saw a huge range in the variability of the phosphorus mass balance across these farms in the same region. This gets to be able to target the different actors across the landscape. And I see Jeremy turned on his video, so I guess I'm getting the hook here.
Thank you very much, Zach. It's a really great information, and we'll be having some questions later to highlight some of the importance of targeting. So if we move on to the next slide, our next presentation will be from Scott Heidel. Mr. Heidel works with the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection as the section chief for the Chesapeake Bay Partnership Section. So thanks for being with us, Scott. Take it away.
All right, thank you very much. So we're going to talk about watershed prioritization for rapid gains in habitat as well as water quality. Next slide. So what I mean by prioritization, we're looking at small agricultural watersheds that are no less or no larger than 25 square miles. And actually, we found that less than 10 square miles is even better. So we prioritize to have minimal impairments to pick the low-hanging fruit for fast victories and delistings. And what I mean by delistings, when a watershed or the segments within a watershed are listed as impaired on the integrated report, we try to focus on those to do remediation, do conservation, and get those taken off of that list of impaired waters. But what we really need are active restoration partners and cooperative landowners. Without those, we're not going to be able to get any of the BMPs that we need. Next slide, please. So with the selection process, we use a few of these tools. One is our integrated report, and that is a geospatial link to all of our listings for impaired waterways. We also use the model from Stroud Water Research Center, Model My Watershed, that gives you a really quick analysis of all of the land uses, their percentage within the watershed, and then what their contribution is to the pollutant loads of nitrogen, phosphorus, as well as sediment. And we also use the Watershed Resources Registry, and that shows you opportunities for riparian restoration as well as protection, as well as wetland restoration and protection in particular. And then we compare that with our most effective basins layers for funding as one of the funding sources. Next slide, please. So here you can see some screenshots of those tools. So on the registry up at the top left-hand side, you can see the impaired waterways as well as some highlighted areas for restoration potential for riparian restoration. And then below that, you can see a little screenshot from Model My Watershed, and it gives you an idea of where the land uses are that are contributing to those pollutants. And then moving across to the right on the bottom, this is from our integrated report. From that, you can download an Excel sheet of all of the listings by segment. And then above that are the most effective basins that qualify for funding. Next slide, please. So what we try to do now is what we call BMP saturation. So we develop a targeted watershed implementation plan or an advanced restoration plan, which those were previously referred to as alternative TMDLs. So I also have a live link there to our water restoration facts that gives you an overview of our whole process from standards to monitoring to assessments to TMDLs, and then to grants and implementation of BMPs. But what we try to do is attack the watershed with every BMP that is needed all at the same time, not just piecemeal it, so that we not only take care of the pollutants, but we also restore the habitat. And we conduct pre and post BMP monitoring as well as modeling so that we can connect all of the dots. Hungry Run is an example of one that we've restored using this technique. Hammer Creek is one that's on the radar. Next slide, please. So connecting the dots of how this all works in, local restoration fits in well with our countywide action plans with the most effective basins, as well as the Bay TMDL, because we're using local restoration that is going to improve the greater good, as well as connect the dots with these things. We use multiple funding sources creatively, and we rely on our conservation districts as well as conservation groups like Trout Unlimited to do the implementation as well as landowner buy-in. Last slide, please. And here's my contact information. If you ever want to follow up on any of this stuff, please email or call. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. It's really nice to see the stories of how a comprehensive conservation plan can come together effectively. So if we move to the next slide, I'll be giving the next presentation about some work that we've done in small agricultural watersheds throughout the Chesapeake Bay. In 2010, the U.S. Geological Survey partnered with the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Environmental Protection Agency to study conservation practice effects in 3 Chesapeake Bay agricultural watersheds. These are the Conewago Creek watershed in southeastern Pennsylvania, the Upper Chester River watershed on Maryland's eastern shore, and the Smith Creek watershed in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. Each one of these watersheds was prioritized for increased amounts of conservation and water quality monitoring, where the overall goal of this study was to assess the water quality effects of agricultural conservation practices. Next slide, please. Over this study period, we saw that the number of conservation practices increased. The graph on the right shows the changes in conservation practices from 2007 through 2020. And when we look at these data, we saw that the number of practices at least doubled in each of these watersheds. But I want you to consider that not all of these practices were designed to reduce nutrient and sediment loads. So we've worked with NRCS to identify which practices have a high expectation to reduce nutrient and sediment loads. And you can see those average statistics summarized for our 3 watersheds. For example, in the Upper Chester River, we saw that most practices had a high expectation to reduce nutrient and sediment loads. Next slide, please. Each one of our watersheds had a unique suite of conservation practices, and that really aligned with the local agricultural land use in the watersheds, but also the local priorities of the conservation districts and partners. So in the Upper Chester River on Maryland's eastern shore, a lot of row crop agriculture, and we saw a lot of practices designed to manage that cropland. In Smith Creek in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, there's a lot of animal agriculture, and we saw a lot of practices designed to manage animal waste and cattle grazing. And in the Conowago Creek watershed in south central Pennsylvania, we have a mixture of agricultural land, and we have a mixture of practices to address multiple sources. However, we did see that many of these practices had some expectation to potentially limit sediment mobilization. Next slide, please. After about 10 years of monitoring, we summarized changes in the nutrient and sediment loads based on what we observed in the streams. And so going into this study, we knew that there were increases in conservation, and we had an expectation that potentially we would see improving nutrient and sediment loads in all of these conditions. But this slide summarizes that we found a slightly different outcome. Anywhere you see information in orange indicates that the load increased over time. Any boxes in gray indicate that there was no change over time, and the boxes in green indicate that there was a decrease or improvement in that water quality constituent over time. So in the Smith Creek watershed, we can see that nitrogen, phosphorus, and suspended sediment loads increased over the 10-year monitoring period. In the Upper Chester River, there was no change in nitrogen and increases in phosphorus and sediment. In both Smith Creek and the Upper Chester, those increases in sediment may have affected the amount of phosphorus and even nitrogen that were transported in the watersheds. In Conowago Creek, we had 2 monitoring stations. At the upstream location shown on the left there, we had increases in nitrogen, no change in phosphorus, and decreases in sediment. And at the downstream monitoring location, we have decreases in all of the monitored constituents. At both of those Conowago monitoring stations, sediment loads decreased. So we're interested to learn more about the driver of that change and its potential relation with conservation on the landscape. And we also know between those monitoring locations, there may have been a point source signal that influenced the improvement in the downstream nutrient loads. Next slide, please. And so considering what we've observed and what we knew about conservation in these watersheds, we're thinking about the management implications of what we've learned. And one thing we're hypothesizing is that the ability of conservation practices to reduce these in-stream loads may have been overshadowed by increasing nutrient applications and in some instances sediment loads. The cartoon on the right indicates the pattern where in many of these watersheds, the input from fertilizer, the input from manure increased over the study period, and those increases may have overshadowed potential benefits from the conservation practices. And so some of these nutrient load reductions may not occur until the nutrient inputs are lowered to align with the local crop nutritional demand. But the third point there also summarizes that these sort of long-term water quality studies are very valuable. It's valuable to increase our statistical tools and to continue building partnerships to address these complex questions. Thank you for your attention. So we'll move on to the next slide, which will change the topic and introduce our 4th speaker. Our 4th speaker is Dr. Matt Cashman. Dr. Cashman is a hydrologist with the U.S. Geological Survey who focuses his research on the interactions between hydrology, geomorphology, and ecology. Thanks for being with us, Matt.
Thank you, Jimmy. Next slide. So today I'm talking about sediment and really what we can get through monitoring and studies on the ground. And so one thing that monitoring can help us do is to really identify where erosion is happening. In the last 5 to 10 years, we've had a series of new kind of technologies and techniques that really allow us to identify and quantify erosion at spatially continuous scales, particularly in channels, head cuts, and in some cases on the uplands with very large soil erosion like rilling. These are things LIDAR, drones, photogrammetry, and we can look from county level scales through individual watersheds or reaches, even down to individual banks and the particular details of how a specific bank is eroding. We've had lots of success with this in various types of studies, both for understanding where the hotspots are in the landscape and how erosion rates are changing before and after interventions, and how those might compare with other modeled estimates that are traditionally being used. Next slide, please. Monitoring allows us to understand when sediment is moving. This is a really crucial component of sediment transport and loads, because most sediment is in suspension, and that is being transported during only a few large events in the year. Up to 30% or more of a load can be transported in one day. Here's a figure on the right for daily at One River by me, where some 50 to 60% of the load is moving in a day. And over 90% of the annual load could be transported in just a few days. So if you're not there monitoring, getting the information about what's going on, you might be entirely missing the story. And the best way to do that is with direct sensors that are there, getting kind of continuous time monitoring, like a turbidity sensor. It is important to note, however, that runoff and concentration at lower flows can still affect in-stream habitat. So if you're trying to monitor for or trying to improve fishing and other kind of habitat conditions, those other times are important too. But if you're really just aiming for load reductions and that final number at the end of the day, it's really important to catch the timing in those few large storms. Next slide, please. Monitoring helps answer what's the source, because are you trying to prioritize sediment reductions because of stream bank erosion or things coming off the uplands? Because those require very different approaches. And our monitoring studies that we've done have shown that oftentimes the real sources of sediment in a river can be very different than what's coming off of a model. So one approach is called sediment fingerprinting. It's a monitoring technique that Alan Gellis and others, including myself, have been doing, where we can look at chemical and other signatures of the sediment itself, match it up to the different sources on the landscape, and then be able to confidently say, 30% of all the sediment that's moving in this channel is coming from forest or from crops or from pasture. And one study here with a QR link and a citation, if you want to check it out, looking at Smith Creek in Virginia, about how there, Alan found that stream banks were a large portion of the sediment load. And when compared to the TMDL that was actually in place for the area, stream banks weren't even incorporated in it. So even if you somehow cut down the sediment loads from the uplands, you still would never reach the target because of the contribution coming from that unaccounted for source. Next slide, please. Why does location matter? Not all erosion is going to make it to the river, and we just had a presentation about this before, but being able to understand where these hotspots are and this idea of connectivity. So if an area is highly connected, which in the figure on the right here is in red, versus low connected in green or blue, that is showing about if sediment erodes, is it actually going to make it to the water and contribute to a load? Because that eroded sediment and runoff might be intercepted by a riparian buffer or a streamline. And we have new techniques where we could look at this and see across scales where even in a single farm field, some of that farm might be disconnected versus the other half of it being very well connected and bypassing a buffer, running down a road, or going right past a break in the riparian buffer zone. And those are prime areas for intervention. Next slide, please. And we can use this monitoring techniques to show success. We have a few studies. I recommend you check out this citation about how we can do before and after with these continuous sensors to show improvements to load, show improvements to sediment transport. And we're collaborating with our colleagues up in New York to also fingerprint before and after to show how management interventions have specifically reduced the sources that they've been targeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. It's really valuable having this information at the workshop because sometimes what we learn and how to manage the sediment mobilization can really differ from nutrients. So really appreciate this information. So our last presentation for the first half of the workshop will be from Lisa Duranchek. Ms. Duranchek works with the U.S. Department of Agricultural Natural Resource Conservation Service in the Resource Assessment Branch. She is the leader for the Watershed Assessment Studies Network of USDA's Conservation Easement Assessment Project, or SEEP. Thanks for being here today and rounding out our presentations for the first half of the workshop. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jimmy, for the invitation to share as part of your group today. I have some unfortunate timing of grass cutting outside, so hopefully, if you have problems hearing, just let me know. I'll speak up. Next slide. So I was asked to share with you a little bit about our watershed assessment studies, which is part of the Conservation Effects Assessment Project of USDA. And we've been working on the SEEP project for 20 years now. Across this national network, we've had over 50 individual projects and a number of network studies. So I will only be able to give you a little tidbit about what we're about during this short presentation. And I invite you to go to our website or to contact me afterwards for more information. Primary goals of what we work on in the watershed assessment studies are things that you're focused on in this session today. One is quantifying measurable effects of conservation practices at watershed scales and smaller scales within that. We're also working to enhance our understanding of the effects of conservation within that setting of a watershed. And ultimately, we hope that all of this knowledge goes towards informing local watershed conservation strategies. And that's been a big part of our focus for the last decade plus of our work in SEEP, is translating this science into practice. So that shows you the map of our national network. We have had 5 different watershed studies within the Chesapeake Bay watershed over time. 2 of them continue to be ongoing. Next slide. Thank you. And so one of the things that we like to do is utilize all these individual projects to collaborate and work together on emerging issues or conservation resource concerns. So I've highlighted in yellow some of the ones that we're currently working on, where we do have data collection in the Chesapeake Bay watershed as part of our projects. As you can see, we cover a range of topics, and you'll be hearing more, I think, in the second part of this session about information needs and upcoming research priorities. But these are just some things that we are working on across USDA with NRCS, ARS, and our many university partners. Thanks. Next slide. So I was asked to share a little bit about what we have learned, and I would invite you to check out some of those citations at the bottom of the slide there. More than a decade ago now, in 2012, we published a book, which you can access for free online, that really synthesizes a lot of the lessons that we've learned about assessing the effects of conservation practices on water quality, how best to do that, what we've learned so far, and using that information to inform effective conservation programs and practices going forward. So you can access those on the SEEP website. Some of the main points I wanted to share today is that we have documented that conservation practices do work. USDA has a long history of trying to assess water quality impacts of conservation, going all the way back to the early 1990s with USDA's Rural Clean Water Project, which was collaboration with other agencies at that time. However, I think we've also been able to determine that while we've made gains in some cases, we do still have some critical conservation needs that exist in other cases, and Jimmy's data highlighted this as well. So we can document measurable improvements in watersheds, but it is a challenge to do that. And so one of the things that we do in our projects is work across scales. We do have nested within our small watersheds, which are typically about Huck 12 scale. We'll have sub-watersheds where we're doing some more detailed monitoring and assessment and commonly we have edge of field sites also within that. We also tend to try to utilize a paired watershed approach because statistically that gives us a little more power with the data that we collect as opposed to just before and after. But these are some lessons we've learned based on our experiences and that whole collection of projects that I mentioned. And again, you can read more about the details of those in that blue book. We have determined, as was highlighted here, that conservation planning comprehensively is really needed. So you need to look not only at the field scale, but also at the watershed to inform effective water quality conservation planning. And we really want to emphasize that oftentimes you're going to need suites or systems of conservation practices over single practices to affect a change in water quality, or sometimes to manage trade-offs or unintended consequences that can also occur. So identifying those critical source areas really improves effectiveness. Next slide.
And Lisa, you are over 5 minutes, so if you can maybe summarize your last couple of slides briefly.
Sure. It was already mentioned that working in smaller watersheds is very important. And, identifying the specific water quality constituents of concern is really the place to start, as well as their sources. Zach touched on this, and then identifying appropriate systems of conservation practices to address those. And one of the earlier speakers touched on hydrology and the importance of identifying transport pathways. And lastly, I'll just wrap up by saying on the next slide, across our SEEP watersheds network, over half of our projects have measured water quality benefits at the watershed scale, despite the difficulty and challenges of doing this. And those are some papers that you can look at that discuss some of those findings a little more. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. It's really great to see this work represented. You all have been a leader in this field for a long time, so we love continuing to learn from these studies. So thanks to all our speakers in the first half. We're now going to invite you all to share some feedback through our Mentimeter system. So if you all kept up the Mentimeter website on your phone or your browser, we're going to move back into that interface now and ask you a few questions about what you heard in this first section. I think August will help pull that up on screen for us.
And if you joined after the first test run with Mentimeter, there's instructions in the chat. You can use the QR code on screen. You can also go to www.menti.com and enter the code.
Yeah, so if we maybe move on to the first question, August. So on this question, we're asking folks to rank their response on a scale of 1 to 5 about, in general, how much they value using water quality monitoring data and scientific insights to develop conservation plans or strategies and kind of move towards this vision of data-driven decision-making. So you can move the slider there and submit your response. We're going to hide the results for the first few seconds and then I think show a preview and see how folks are voting. And while folks are voting too, we're going to compile this feedback and share it with all the attendees after the talk. So please vote on all these questions, participate in all the questions, and it really increases the value of this input. So we really appreciate your time doing this.
Okay. Got 61 folks that have voted. We've got 86 participants, so got a couple stragglers, but it looks like from these results, Jimmy, we're high value on water quality monitoring data and scientific insights when developing these plans.
Yeah, thank you all for your feedback. We're going to offer you a couple different question types here. So in this question, we're going to ask you to rank these following options. So we'll let folks read them, but they're going to reflect the topics that you heard in our presentations about using suites of practices, addressing sources, targeting locations on the landscape. So take a minute to read those and rank your choices, and we'll see how the audience feels about this topic. And if folks have comments in the chat too, please drop in your thoughts in the chat window and we can talk about things there as well. But appreciate everyone taking the time to read through this question. Want to see how people are voting, August? All right. We're a very balanced group.
Oh, we got some change here.
So targeting is resonating with folks. That reflects the work from that Zach shared with us. Surplus applications are on there and suites of practices. The challenge is all of this is important. We'll wait till see if we can get the number up closer to 60, and then we've got one more question for you before we turn back to the presentation. So thank you for taking the time for this input.
It looks like the second and third choices here are pretty neck and neck.
Yeah.
Oh, I feel like we're at the Derby.
Yeah, getting pretty stable.
Yeah.
Responses.
I'd like to see a plot of the responses over time, but maybe that's going too far in Mentimeter.
I think it's great to see the importance of targeting highlighted here. It's a really great concept.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Should we move forward to the last question?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, last one for y'all. This one, you don't have to make as many decisions because you can choose multiple options, but we're curious of the audience's feedback about some of these challenges and benefits that we've seen observed in the talks where we've demonstrated conservation practice effects. In some studies, we've identified the challenge of identifying those effects. And so we're just curious of the group's feedback about what are the potential reasons for these differences across our water quality studies. So you can select as many options as you'd like on this question. And this will be our last one of the section. Let's see the results so far.
Okay. Oh, we're changing.
It's great though. So the number one vote is practice effects are offset by intensifying ag and urban land activities. I think we've seen that in areas of the Chesapeake, and this feedback kind of helps us when we're thinking about our water quality studies and interpreting results. And I hope it helps think about when folks are planning practices on the landscape, some of the topics that will be important to focus on. So that's a pretty clear front runner, along with water quality data not being collected from the correct location. So I think that's going to be a great topic for our next section as we move into that, about what do we need from our future water quality studies. We're getting about a similar number of responses, 55 or 60. This looks really good.
Yeah, we ready to jump into part 2?
I think so. Thank you all for that exercise. We're going to do that one more time at the end of this section. But now I'll turn it over to Kaylin to lead us through the second section.
Thanks, Jimmy, and thank you again to all our speakers and organizers. This has been a great part one, and we're getting ready to start with part two here. And I see Elizabeth is already on screen, so thank you so much. Elizabeth Hoffman is going to lead us off here. She is an evaluation and reporting coordinator with the Maryland Department of Agriculture. So in just a moment, we'll have Elizabeth take it away for what do we need from future water quality studies. All right, we can go to the next slide, please, August, and thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So again, Elizabeth Hoffman with the Maryland Department of Agriculture, and kind of being tasked with the question of what is needed from future studies and what can we kind of take from them, and kind of providing an agency perspective as someone who is often tasked with speaking to kind of our delivery channels of soil conservation districts and as well as other stakeholders of how do we really make progress towards our goals. So again, speaking as a state agency, not only one that is working towards kind of further conservation adoption on the ground as part of our TMDL goals and beyond, as additional topics come into play, climate resiliency and other initiatives, but also as a state that has a pretty high level of adoption of best management practices for some years now from our farmers. So really thinking what are the next steps and how can we, how can future research support those efforts? So one thing is really looking at a holistic approach and kind of the idea of incentivizing treatment systems. As farmers are familiar with the many programs that are available for cost share and technical support, kind of delivery of implementation on the ground, how do we take things to the next level and kind of amplify effectiveness? We see a need for kind of promoting the idea of holistic planning across metrics. So beyond just the nutrient reduction potential, to also incorporating wildlife habitat, pollinator richness, carbon sequestration, soil health, retaining green space, and building a strong, local food system, which would allow the conversation to kind of move towards treatment trains and the stacking of conservation practices in a way that can be incentivized and rewarded, either through pay for performance or crediting towards our goals across many plans, watershed implementation plans, greenhouse gas reductions, climate resiliency, wetland adaptation and saltwater intrusion plan. So this also, allows us to value the conservation efforts being put in place in ways that we've always known, but maybe have not been able to quantify. And so looking at kind of getting from study to field, what are barriers in adoption or communication of new science? So the idea that, a bridge that we could be bolstering is kind of that movement of study findings and how they're delivered to landowners and farmers. It's important to note that across sectors, we often say landowners, but to recognize that in the agricultural sector, ours are farmers, meaning not only do they have a role in stewardship and conserving resources, but they also have to think about being economically viable as an operation in order to provide food and commodities to our communities. So our sector needs to continually keep stakeholders engaged, and there are kind of no silver bullets. Understanding regional concerns across a diversity of operations is key as we look at kind of focused in studies. It's important that we address the many factors involved in the decision to implement new practices, things like maintenance of practices once they are beyond a contract, things like equipment needs, not just kind of upfront materials cost. Margins are very small for farmers, which does not always allow for quick pivots. So taking a chance on kind of new management methods or newly available technologies requires sound science to support a full understanding of those methods or technologies. And we also need to be sensitive to providing stepwise options, so short-term as well as long-term. So not going directly to retirement of land, but for example, looking at alternative crops that are more salt tolerant. Measuring co-benefits, kind of looking at ecosystem values. For actual studies, it would be good to see an exploration of new measurements of success. As conversations turn towards beyond 2025 and thinking about water quality and restoration at both a more focused field scale, as well as kind of a higher 30,000 foot level, thinking more large scale about the ecosystem and communities within the ecosystem as a whole, we are increasingly highlighting the co-benefits that come along with best management practices. And there's a need for valuing those beyond the traditional framework of nutrient and sediment reduction. We often, make plans and measure progress within a model that does not necessarily assign a value to benefits. So that becomes a challenge when asked to measure success and track progress. As funding and programs, both with our federal partners and at a state level, are often tied to reduction values or quantitative metrics, there's a need for studies that speak to the value of those benefits as well as cost. So future studies working to quantify benefits connected to things like carbon sequestration and soil health, with values that can be agreed upon by the scientific community at large, would help inform decisions and drive program alignment. And then lastly, balancing needs to allow for thoughtful prescription. So farmers often, have a saying, they're not making new land. So as the agricultural community continues to play a part in advancing restoration and conservation efforts, we need information to be cross-pollinated so that they can thoughtfully decide how best to manage their land for the many purposes. When conversation arises around things like removing cropland for tree plantings, it's important to assess how that affects local food access and the priority of keeping the most productive land in production. That may look like researchers working closely with existing trusted channels of deliveries, SCDs, NGOs, in order to understand priorities in conserving resources and any barriers to adoption, and to best communicate new science in a way that allows highly informed decisions across many groups working towards common goals. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. In August, we can go to the next slide. And there's Elizabeth's contact information. If you go to the next slide, please, I'd like to introduce Jamie Arthurs, who is the state resource conservationist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service in Delaware. So take it away, Jamie.
Thank you, Kaylin. So at NRCS and our partners address resource concerns through planning and implementation of conservation practices, primarily through technical assistance and, when possible, through financial assistance to meet both our clients and agency objectives, which is primarily to maintain the resource base to the extent that sustainability and the intended use of that resource is not impaired. So with that in mind, NRCS often thinks of several key items that we feel future water quality studies would better position us to continue to meet our client and agency objectives. So, you can kind of see the key items that we really, after quite a bit of discussion, really kind of focused on. And the first one is position. And Zach kind of talked about this earlier in those initial presentations. Are conservation practices located in the right place to address the resource concern? Oftentimes we can physically go out there and see and determine through tools that there is a resource concern present, but are we addressing that resource concern at its source in the right position in the landscape? And oftentimes we ask ourselves, is the conservation practice addressing the water quality in newer and or older water? And is it the best practice to implement or to achieve water quality goals in the short and or long term? Building on that, we often think about synergy, and Lisa actually mentioned this a little bit early in her presentation. If we are in the right position in the landscape, is one conservation practice enough, or does it require a suite of conservation practices to achieve the desired effects? And if so, what is that combination of conservation practices to achieve those goals? The third one, and one of the big ones for us, is outcomes. Did implementation of conservation practices or a practice achieve the desired effect? Having data to support implementation of conservation practices and using that data to support future outreach efforts for conservation practice implementation is paramount for both NRCS and its partners when delivering technical assistance and financial assistance to our clients. And we'd like data confirming that we are doing our part in the agricultural sector, and how and where we can do more to achieve our mission is very important to us. And finally, one of the big things for us as well is that innovation piece. We always think of conservation practice as a technology, and as with any technology, it needs to be revisited and reevaluated over time. So can we achieve higher levels of conservation with structural modifications to a conservation practice? Can we achieve higher levels of conservation with changes to the management of that practice? Or do we need a whole new conservation practice to address those resource concerns? Thank you. I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks so much, Jamie. Really, really appreciate it. And your perspective's really important. And I am excited about working together in the future. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gary Shank. Gary is a hydrologist with the U.S. Geological Survey, who leads the development of the Chesapeake Bay program's watershed model. So thanks, Gary.
Hey, thanks, Kaylin. I'm here to report on a workshop that was sponsored by the Chesapeake Program Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee, or STAC, on local monitoring. This workshop was led by Casey Filipino and Carl Berger, which reflects the largely, as well as the picture right here, reflect the largely urban focus of this. But about a third of the participants were from agricultural areas or agricultural monitoring studies. And so a lot of the recommendations that came from this workshop are cross-cutting, and some of them were very specific to agricultural areas. So the workshop was held back in March, and right now we have the almost final draft findings and recommendations. And finally, I want to note that these slides are mostly taken from Casey Filipino in a presentation she made to STAC 2 days ago. Next slide, please. So this is Casey's slide, and it summarizes the major takeaways of this workshop. And these are recommendations specifically for the Chesapeake Bay program to consider. And so the top one there, discussing policy changes to incorporate monitoring. The idea is that we have the TMDL, and we have a model cast, which is used to track implementation progress in the TMDL. But as many speakers have mentioned, we're really, really interested in outcomes. And so if somehow we are able to measure those outcomes that are relevant to the TMDL, perhaps there are some policy, some ways we can use that in policy in addition or instead of pure modeling approaches. Related to that is the one to the left, compare with TMDL expectations. So within the TMDL, if you're using the CAST watershed model to roll up the amount of implementation of management practices, and you find through your monitoring that you have achieved more or less progress than what that model is expecting, then that certainly has implications for how you deal with that policy-wise. Getting directly to use in that Chesapeake Bay program TMDL model or CAST, on the lower left-hand side, include local data and model calibration. Anything that can be expressed as a load for a given area for a particular amount of time can be used. And so we're working on ways to make sure we gather all that data. Second down on the right, look for other established data sets. We tried to sweep and get some of the more prominent local monitoring studies, but I'm sure we didn't get them all. So we should go out there and find what's there. And then the last one on the lower right-hand side, include local monitoring studies as generalized knowledge in the Bay program's watershed model or CAST. And let me dig into that a little bit with a slide that's taken from Jimmy Weber, which is the next one. The idea of this slide is that you often just can't take observed data and immediately use it in policy or use it in a model. It takes synthesis, either through statistical models or combining with everything that you know about the watershed, or combining with other similar types of studies. And that's what's shown there in the green, is that we're using these observational studies taking place in small watersheds to generate technical information through analysis and statistical models. And some of that technical information in the blue box can directly inform management, and some of that can directly inform CAST, the management model that we're using. And so that recommendation to include this as generalized knowledge means that we have to really understand how best to conduct local monitoring studies in order to generate information that is usable by the management community, either directly or through interaction with a model. And so how you do that is really the final slide here. So the next slide has two overarching recommendations that really came out primarily of the agricultural monitoring group at that workshop. And so on the left, we're talking about when you set up a study, make sure that you are doing hypothesis-driven design, and that as part of that, we're going to have to develop new statistical tools to interpret the data that we collect. So and under hypothesis-driven design, what the participants were saying is that we really need to make sure we start with an idea in mind. And I think from previous presenters, we want to know the effect of management practices, essentially. And so in order to do that, you have to know where those management practices are. You have to know the watershed properties. You have to select your sites and your monitoring frequencies and the parameters that you collect, all based on whether or not they'll fit with some sort of model that can predict causally the effect that BMPs are having. And that really gets us to that recommendation on the right-hand side, is that in order to do that properly, we're going to have to develop new statistical tools. So statistical tools, one way to think about them it's a formalization of a hypothesis. And so if we are looking at these hypothesis-driven design studies, then we've got to make sure that we've got the tools to interpret them. And the final thing that I'll say is that the bullet there on the bottom right, one of those statistical tools that is not directly related to these hypothesis-driven design when you're dealing with a single watershed is, let's develop some tools to take advantage of the synoptic data that have been collected throughout the watershed, but unfortunately have not been used to great extent yet. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Really appreciate it. I'll go ahead to the next slide because I think I know the speaker. Hey, everyone. Kaylin Gutman. I'm a life scientist with EPA at the Chesapeake Bay program. And I really want to give a big thank you to Brett Sullivan, my colleague, for a lot of this material. So we'll go ahead to the next slide, please, August. So I'm going to be talking about the request from the Principal Staff Committee to provide information on what is needed to improve the Chesapeake Bay program monitoring networks, including an overview of the current status and threats, and what do we need to address monitoring network, the capacity, and meet shortfalls. Next slide, please. So a very large undertaking, or very large review was undertaken to look at all the different monitoring networks, which are shown on a diagram on the right. This was a joint effort between the Chesapeake Bay program STAR team, monitoring team, and tons of input from the staff leadership team. There were a number of interactions with goal implementation teams and partners who operate and maintain these networks to, 1, evaluate their information needs, 2, determine their priorities, and 3, discuss potential enhancements to monitoring efforts. Next slide, please. And so this report, which there's a link here in the chat or on the slide, and I'm sure we can add to the chat if you haven't seen it already, please do check it out. The whole report is worth your time. There is a really great and short executive summary, but the main points from this report are: continued monitoring is critical. Monitoring is, for many Chesapeake Bay program outcomes, insufficient, but there are opportunities for additional funding. So the next slide, please. And so from this report, there were a number of investment recommendations, which can be summed as follows. First, we need to assess tidal water quality standards to support living resources. Second, we need to evaluate implementation priorities for watershed-based outcomes. And third, we need to document our progress toward meeting watershed agreement goals and outcomes. Next slide, please. So really, This report helps solidify the fact that the Chesapeake Bay program monitoring networks have a solid foundation of investments with partner support to help function, but there is a gap in investments to maintain, grow, and enhance monitoring networks for all outcomes. Next slide, please. The current investments plus additional measures are needed to fulfill the recommendations to the Chesapeake Bay program so we can have monitoring in place to complete this full picture as seen here on this slide of attaining all outcomes in the watershed agreement. So with that, I will wrap up my portion and introduce our next speaker. So we can go to the next slide. Thanks, August. We're going to hear from Mark Nardi, who is a geographer with the U.S. Geological Survey. So take it away, Mark. You are on mute. It had to happen to someone. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks. I'm going to talk a little bit today about a new initiative by that's being spearheaded by EPA, NRCS, and USGS, and it has to do with hopefully observing water quality changes in small agricultural watersheds that are water quality changes that are related to implementation of conservation or best management practices. Next slide, please. So the impetus for this this effort comes from some work that was done, actually a group of teams that was put together by EPA, and it included EPA, NRCS, and USGS back in 2020. Next slide, please. The outcome of which was one of the teams, there was a water quality team, there was an implementation or agricultural conservation practice funding team, and then there was a local outreach team. The water quality monitoring team came up with a white paper. Next slide, please. And the outcome of the white paper, essentially, one of the major outcomes of the white paper was basically that we're not paying enough attention to small watersheds, especially those first order, second, third order streams, and that we should try to do that. So the major challenge identified by the team was the need to enhance monitoring at finer scales to better connect implementation of management practices with water quality and sediment changes right in the watershed. And that's a lot of what we've been talking about and hearing about today. So next slide, please. So why small watersheds? This plot shows on the x-axis area of watersheds that are currently being observed kind of within the USGS universe of watersheds. And then on the y-axis is the amount of agricultural land within each of those watersheds. So you can see the upper left-hand corner of this plot shows very few small agricultural watersheds that are being observed. In fact, there aren't a whole bunch of mostly agricultural watersheds within the universe. So next slide, please. Right. So this just kind of shows a nested approach to the way that we would look at things. And again, this kind of goes from thinking back to the last slide that we saw, farm field, all the way up to a large watershed scenario. So next slide. Right. Okay, great. So, and a lot of these areas are already covered by other researchers, as we've seen, like with Zach's presentation and some others, kind of the field farm scale research is being well documented and observed. Next slide, please. Showcase watersheds fit somewhere in between the subwatershed and very large watershed. Next slide, please. And the non-tidal network that is run by the Chesapeake Bay program observes is mostly, almost exclusively, although not exclusively, large watersheds. Next slide. So this is the research gap that the paper observed and they're trying to fill with this work. Next slide. So what's going on is that the EPA, NRCS, and USGS, and as we go along, we're picking up local cooperators as well that are interested in this, are funding and implementing 5 stations across the bay at sites yet to be determined, where we're going to collect data, real-time water quality data, 6 parameters, as well as discrete sampling that fits the NTN schedule. So again, we're looking for nutrients and sediment. We're looking for response of water quality, those parameters in water quality, to implementation of conservation practices. Next slide, please. So where are we? In FY20, late FY22, EPA's provided USGS with money to buy equipment, which is done, and we've got that equipment just about all in hand. We've been going through the site selection process, talking with cooperators, everyone from NRCS, state departments of ag, down to the conservation district levels, and we've started a few field recons. It's, of course, it goes a little slower than we want, but we're pecking away at it and continuing to make sure that it's a priority for us, and we're super excited about getting these sites installed. We're shooting for beginning of the fiscal year. Some of the sites may make it, others we're still working on trying to get things worked out. Next slide, please. So why is site selection so complicated? This diagram on the left kind of shows you got to have all of this stuff in place. You have to have their physical limits to the instrumentation, how much water, how much flow we've got, available data from other sites. Ideally, we pick up on sites maybe that already had some work done at it. They're willing landowners. There is the consideration of implementation of conservation practices. That is the landscape saturated, kind of as we saw in some cases that Pennsylvania is trying to do. But we're really looking for those changes. So ideally, we have a place where there may be some implementation, but that we expect to have implementation. Funding partners, they've got their own desires. How does that dive and fit in with what we're trying to accomplish? And then probably most importantly is people who are actually willing to let you go out on their landscape and do this kind of stuff and observe what they're doing on the landscape and how it impacts water quality. So that's a really kind of delicate dance to put all this stuff together. Conservation districts have been fantastic in helping, and river keepers in helping us find willing landowners and have those conversations with folks. Next slide, please. So one of the big questions, and this is my last slide, Caitlin. One of the big questions that we come back to is, what is the scale that we're going to observe? Ideally, we'll observe somewhere in between that small sub watershed and watershed. But are we going to be able to observe a single practice? Or are we going to be able to observe and quantify through statistical methods the effects of multiple practices in a single sub watershed? So this is all part of the science that we're working through. And that's all I've got. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Really appreciate it. And with that, we are going to switch back over to the same Mentimeter and go through a couple of discussion questions. So again, thanks to all of our presenters. We were about on time, so well done to the group. And so these questions we have, there's 3 more of them. We're focused on, asking the question, what do we need from future water quality studies?
My apologies, I'm bringing it up.
Oh, no worries. It's all good. We got PowerPoint, we've got Mentimeter, Zoom. There's a lot of moving parts. All is good. Appreciate your work on this, August. We would be totally lost without you. Awesome. Okay, perfect. We got some thumbs up. This is great. Y'all are Mentimeter pros. So now we're going to go to the next question. The first question for part 2, what do we need from water quality studies? Oh, that's me. So here our question is, what elements of future water quality studies would be most helpful for addressing your conservation priorities? So you can pick multiple options here. So we'll give it a moment, wait for some folks to provide some answers before revealing the results. And we do appreciate the group taking the time to read these. You think, oh, it's easy to craft a question, but in fact, we had to be thoughtful about the answers and character limits. Okay, about 10 responses. Or logged on rather. Okay. All right, when we get to about 30 results, let's start to see what they look like. Oh, okay. So it looks like the majority right now, we have got identifying nutrient and sediment hotspots on the landscape to target conservation effects, but pretty close in number to determining nutrient and sediment sources, manure, fertilizer, stream banks, etc., physical and chemical tracers. And also fairly close to identifying, okay, we got that. I think we're moving along. Okay, interesting.
Very balanced responses.
And it was the question number 1 was very balanced for the 4 choices we gave for who's in the room. So, wow, I would not be I am surprised that a lot of balanced responses. So that's really interesting. Okay, let's jump to the next question, please, August. Okay, so this is a ranking question. So we're asking y'all to rank, you know, these options from most to least important. So the question is, could new insights about the following topics be used to plan water quality conservation efforts? So pick your top choice first and follow in suit. Let me see. Okay, getting some thumbs up. That's a good thing.
You know, the rankings always take a little more thought. So appreciate people doing this.
I promise the last question is not a ranking question.
A little bit more reading on this one, so people are taking their time. It's great. And again, we're going to share this feedback back with all attendees. So it's really, really valuable to have folks participate in this so we can really get a pulse of this workshop.
And we'll also take the time to review the chat and the Q&A. So we really appreciate the multiple levels of engagement for such a large group. So thank you all. All right, let's see. We're about 30. Yeah, perfect. Okay. Oh, we've been tied up. Okay, so what is the top one? How do intensifying agricultural activities and expanding urban development affect water quality responses, which is now 2. And similarly ranked. Oh, back to 1. What are the major factors that affect changing amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus and sediment in streams over time? Interesting how the top 4 are pretty close.
They're very close. You know, the ideas about intensifying inputs kind of align with some of the feedback on a previous question where that was identified as a kind of a priority of something we want to know more about.
Yep. Oh, last one. Okay. Well, this is great. Thank you so much. So we're going to advance to the final Mentimeter question here. So this is put yourself in a decision maker position. If you are or you aren't in your job, put yourself there now. You just imagine that you have been given the keys to how we manage the Chesapeake Bay watershed and at all levels. So if this was up to you, how would you recommend that our research community split their time between the following 2 activities? So the first option here is investing in the development and operation and interpretation of new water quality studies. That's the key word there, new. Or investing in outreach and collaboration with local partners to communicate the management implications of existing studies. So new versus communicate what we have. If you pick 50% for each one, you think it should be an even split, 100 for one, it's all in that basket. So think of this as like a fantasy football league or points. you're going to have 100 on screen. And again, if you pick 50-50, you think it's an even split. So we'll give this one another couple moments before we reveal to try not to bias the results. I don't know, Jimmy, I feel like
I think it's going to be 50-50.
It might be split evenly.
Oh, it's great. It's great.
Wow.
Yeah, we like this. This is a real world situation that, you know, we always kind of prioritize our time of how can you spend finite resources. This is a great question. Yeah, so a preference right now for communicating existing information, which is really helpful feedback to hear from this team.
Just edging out new investments.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's certainly things that Kaylin and I can consider with the folks we work with and others on the call. Also, think about this kind of feedback that, you know, a big part of all of our work of communicating these findings. It takes a lot of effort, and I think it kind of speaks to the value of continuing to develop these partnerships. So it's great feedback.
Yeah. Thank you all so much. And August, we can advance to the next slide. We have, I think, right on time, a couple minutes for wrap up.
Yeah, that's it. This is a thank you for sticking with us to the end. Thank you to our wonderful speakers for staying on time. There's a lot of content, and we want you all to leave with an expectation of what's next. You know, so for us, we're going to summarize this feedback you provided and share it with you. We're also going to ask you to respond to a feedback poll that I think Jeremy just put in the chat. He'll also email it to you. So there's opportunity there to kind of tell us what worked, what didn't work. You'll have a space to provide a little bit more feedback about your thoughts to these workshop questions. But also just want to highlight, reach out to us. You know, anyone on this call, anyone you've heard from, continue these conversations and keep looking for announcements for these Submersion series. I think they're really great, unique opportunities. So, Jeremy or Kaylin, anything else?
I just want to say thank you. You know, we had a number of planning calls, a lot of the speakers, other folks that are on this call and not, and we really just appreciate the opportunity to talk and hear from lots of different voices and contexts and perspectives. And, you know, it's really critical as we are approaching the calendar year 2025 and thinking and facing about, you know, what's next. And, you know, the more people we can, you know, hear from, listen to, I think that's the best chance we have to actually strengthen connections between what we do in the research world with water quality and, you know, agricultural conservation practices as well.
Thank you both, and thanks everyone for joining. And I'll say, you know, the link to the form is in the chat. I won't email it out until early next week when I also have the recording from this session uploaded on YouTube and available. So thank you again for joining us and for attending our second Submersion Series webinar. This will definitely be a topic we revisit in other forms moving forward. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks a lot.